Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, and I'm here today with another Omnibus review. Today I'm taking a look at a book that's actually one of my favourites in my collection. This is the Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 2. It's the second volume of the classic Silver Age material. So this stuff picks up immediately following Steve Ditko's departure from Marvel. All of Ditko's run is collected in the first volume. I have already done an Omnibus review for that particular volume. Feel free to check that out if you haven't seen it already. It was actually the first video I did on this channel a few months ago. But this is the second volume, and I think marginally I just about prefer it over the first volume. We'll just quickly take a look at the contents first of all. You get the cover gallery on the back, as you generally do with most Marvel Omnibus. Content's pretty straightforward. So you get the Amazing Spider-Man issues 39 to 67, annuals 3 to 5, and the Spectacular Spider-Man 1 and 2. That's not to be confused with the Spectacular Spider-Man ongoing series that began in, I think, the late 70s. This was actually two kind of experimental comics, almost like prototypes for what would become graphic novels, really. The first of those two, I think, is Black and White, an all black and white magazine type comic, and the second was more of just an extended normal comic book. But we'll have a look at them as we get through the book. This is the second printing of the book, by the way, that I have. This was, I think this came out back in 2016, not too long after I'd actually got into collecting Omnibus. I think I started collecting in 2015/early 2016, so this was actually one of the first Marvel Omnibus editions that I ended up picking up. Timed it well, because this had been out of print for a while, I think, when I first started collecting them. But this is just great stuff, and what I love about this run is there's a great sense of fun about Silver Age Spider-Man, and more so than any other Silver Age title, I just will always highly recommend people check out the Amazing Spider-Man stuff from this time. The Steve Ditko stuff is obviously great, but I think that it really starts to kick off into a higher gear as of this point, really. Now, I know there's debate out there about who kind of drew the better Spider-Man, who plotted the better Spider-Man issues. Was it Ditko? Was it Romita? It's really difficult because for me, they both had a unique feel to their different versions of Spider-Man. You know, Ditko's Spider-Man was very kind of scrawny, unpopular high school kid. He kind of drew everybody in the typical Ditko way, where everybody just looks so uptight and anxious. You can almost feel the stress that characters are going through leaking out of the pages because of how Ditko tended to draw facial expressions. When John Romita came along, you couldn't really have a more different style to switch from Ditko to Romita. Romita had a background in romance comics, and that absolutely came through pretty much straight away. He very much, I think the kind of soap opera elements of the Spider-Man series were very much emphasized during this era. As you see, as we go through here, you get the introduction of Mary Jane, iconic introduction of her, and Peter Parker starts to gain friends, really. Just he has friends for the first time in the series. He was a complete loner during the Ditko run, but as we go through here, he actually starts to gain a social circle, which opens up the possibilities for them to explore, that is Stan Lee and John Romita to explore. The more kind of, as I said, the soap opera aspect of his personal life. So let's get going. This first issue is just talk about a great iconic issue to open a collection with, issue 39. And this is the issue where Peter Parker and the Green Goblin, Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, end up learning each other's identities, which is pretty much a first in superhero comics up to this point. But what you see kind of immediately, really, if you speak interviews with John Romita, he'll say that when he took over this title, he spent the first few issues trying to kind of mimic Ditko's style a little bit. But if that's the case, I've got to say he was doing a pretty terrible job of mimicking it, because right from the beginning, this just looks like pure Romita to me. Basically, most of the guys are extremely handsome. The women are extremely beautiful. I don't think he can physically draw things any other way than that. That's always been his style, and he's really good at it. So no complaints from me, because I think everything looks great. But it is kind of funny, we have to just touch back on the point where the issues plotted by Ditko would always have Peter Parker as an outside figure, as a loner, no friends really. And in this very first issue, as soon as Romita takes over, I think this just goes to show the extent to which Ditko was in fact influencing the plot when he was working on the book. Because straight away in here, you get a sequence where basically Peter Parker and Harry Osborn kind of make up, they sort of start to become friends right from the get-go. But of course that's just the backdrop against the main action of the issue, which is of course this showdown between the Green Goblin and Spidey. But I've always thought that this the grand scheme of the Goblin here is to find out who Spider-Man is such an incredibly simple thing that it makes zero sense why no other villain ever thought of it before, or really since. All the Goblin does is basically follow Spidey from a distance until he changes, back into his, just Peter Parker get up, takes his costume off, and then just follows Peter home and ambushes him. It's absolutely beautiful in its simplicity. It doesn't take a genius to come up with that, but apparently the Goblin was the first villain to ever try that, and nobody's really tried it since. But it all comes out with this big reveal, where he finds out that the Goblin is, of course, Norman Osborn. And, in the next issue, Spidey ends up subduing the Goblin. And what basically happens from then on, from this point right up until, spoiler alert, the death of the Green Goblin, which occurs immediately after the death of Gwen Stacy, there was this kind of frustratingly sort of, annoying recurring plot point where Norman Osborn was suffering from amnesia, which is often criticised as a particularly weak storytelling tool to give a character amnesia, so they conveniently don't remember something. But that is basically what happens after this. In this fight with Spidey, Green Goblin kind of smacks his head. Norman forgets that he is the Goblin, and seemingly everything is okay, but periodically over the next few years, few dozen issues, every now and again Norman would remember that he is the Goblin, they'd have another fight, and then he'd forget about it again. But yeah, you get an introduction of the Rhino in here. You don't get as many key villains introduced during this era as you did during the Ditko era, but you do get some key ones. You get the Rhino in this issue. Also get the Kingpin a bit later on, and Shocker. Those are the key ones really, I think. But I just think that the way that Romita drew this series, it just looks, it's just beautiful artwork, and I just find it really, really nice to look through. And when you're talking about sort of Silver Age comics, there aren't usually that many comics that I think the artwork looks really nice and attractive artwork. I mean, we can all talk about Jack Kirby as the ultimate comic book artist, and obviously he did some amazing work during the Silver Age with Marvel and just through his career in general. But I don't ever think that Kirby's artwork looked kind of aesthetically the best. He could draw an amazing, comic book. He could put in some amazing kind of hugely detailed, massive, splash pages and cosmic beings, but his art never looked visually the best to me. Whether or not you agree with that, that's obviously a different thing. I always thought the best Silver Age artist was John Romita, just in terms of the fact that his artwork it just looks so, it's just so easy on the eye, I think. He draws a good Spider-Man. All the supporting cast look great. He still manages to draw J. Jonah Jameson in that kind of slimy sort of Weasley way that Ditko managed to portray him in. You know, he still looks pretty much the same. And I think what's always been unique about Spider-Man, and as I said a bit already during this era, was really emphasised, it's that soap opera element. It's the fact that as you read these comics, and Spider-Man comics in general, usually anyway, and for me, I can say that I always feel equally interested in the story of what Spider-Man's up to, what Peter Parker's up to in costume as Spider-Man, what villain he's taken down, but also just those moments where he's just being himself, you know, and getting on with his personal life. And how could I not take a moment to just focus on this panel here, the just iconic introduction of Mary Jane. Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot. And this was such a huge moment in the series and in comic books in general. I think historically, she'd been kind of teased. She was a running joke, really, in the series up to this point. Peter Parker was always narrowly avoiding meeting her. He always thought she was going to be, well, the type of girl he didn't want to meet, he wouldn't ever want to meet, basically. And then she turns up, and she's this beautiful red-haired party girl, and he's kind of immediately enamored. You know, he's awestruck. And through the next few issues, you sort of get her integrating into Peter's newly formed social circle with Gwen Stacy, Harry Osborn, and Flash Thompson. And yeah, it's just fun stuff, really. And then all the while, obviously, you've got Peter having to rush off and fight the Rhino and fight the Vulture and whoever else is showing up. But yeah, just through here, I just find these to be such a fun era of comics. You get an annual here with the Avengers. This is actually, I think this is a story where Spider-Man is interested in becoming an Avenger, and they kind of give him a task to prove his worth. I think this is this story anyway. They want him to go and find the Hulk. Yeah, this is it. They want him to go and basically face the Hulk and you know, stop one of the Hulk's latest rampages. And he kind of realizes that it's not the right thing to do because the Hulk just wants to be left alone, you know, as he generally always did in these early years of Marvel. That was always the Hulk's thing. He just wanted to be left alone, and people insisted on chasing him, so he ended up getting in fights. But Spidey kind of doesn't want that. He speaks to him and realizes that bringing the Hulk back to the Avengers is not the best thing for the Hulk, so he lets him go and confesses to the Avengers that he's failed his mission. So he doesn't join the Avengers. I really like that story. It just kind of shows what differentiates Spider-Man from other characters. I mean, from an editorial point of view, the reason he does that is because they never wanted Spider-Man to be part of a team. But it's a cool moment to just see that, you know, that human element of Peter Parker. You know, he will often do things often to his own kind of frustration. He will end up doing things that's not in his own best interest. You know, stuff that can outright inconvenience him in many ways in different situations. But it's what makes Peter Parker such a great character. You know, he's the ultimate nice guy. You know, as far as that old saying, sort of nice guys finish last, he can quite often be seen to be embodying that sort of mentality. I mean, I don't think that nice guys finish last is necessarily true, but we know what it means. You get great appearances, though, by a lot of the already established characters in here. So you got a Lizard story here. I've always thought the Lizard was a a good character. So often when I do these reviews and I flick through these books, I kind of just find myself reminded of the details of the stories, and I'm just, as I'm flicking through this now, I'm remembering most of them and finding myself just wanting to reread it. But one of my problems as a collector, as a comic book reader, I've got all these books and almost never enough time to read them all. So it's all well and good me saying I want to reread this, but I've got about 6 other books that I'm supposed to read first on my to-read list. And it just never ends. Not that that's the worst problem to have in the world, but yeah, it's something I often find myself thinking about. If only I had more time to read. This is, yeah, but I don't know really what I can really add to it beyond the fact that it's a classic era of Spider-Man. It holds up as being really fun to read. You get great villains appearing throughout. It's a cool story here where the Vulture is there's kind of a new guy trying to take on the mantle of the Vulture, take it away from Adrian Toomes, who's the original Vulture. And then the original Vulture comes back, and you got 2 Vultures for a bit. And it's just fun. Often it's very silly fun. I mean, that's kind of, if you could summarize what Silver Age comics generally were, I'd say silly, cheesy, often ridiculous fun. Just about sums it up most of the time. Really cool. I really like this image. I've always liked this image. Spider-Man laying beaten, exhausted in the snow. And then getting back up and having another go at it. Something else that Spider-Man ends up doing a lot. Quite often he gets beaten, but through sheer force of will and determination, he doesn't give up, he comes back, and he wins in the end. And isn't that a great kind of mentality to have in life in general, for any of us? By this point, John Romita has clearly given up any attempt whatsoever to structure the comic and to draw anybody like Steve Ditko was drawing them, even though I don't think he ever succeeded in that. But as you can see here, the panel layouts even are starting to... This doesn't really resemble how Ditko drew the comic. Quite often Ditko just stuck with the rigid, conventional 6 to 9 square panel structure in comics. This, for the time, even though it wouldn't look it now, you wouldn't really say it is now, but for the time this was more experimental, a little bit more unorthodox than the style that Ditko had been drawing in. You just got different numbers of panels, page to page, different sizes, the occasional splash page thrown in. Gwen Stacy looking absolutely beautiful. Gotta love John Romita's Gwen Stacy. Amazing right there. That's one of the most iconic panels in the book, one of the most iconic panels in all of Spider-Man and even comic book history. Spider-Man No More. Peter Parker is sick and tired of putting his own life on hold because of his responsibilities of being Spider-Man. This key plot point was famously used in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. So it's what's amazing here is that this was a story that's just contained in one comic. This is Amazing Spider-Man 50, and in the course of just 22 pages, that entire story happens. So he gets fed up, gives up being Spider-Man, realizes he needs to be Spider-Man despite the sacrifices that requires him to make, because he has the ability to help other people. So with great power there must also come great responsibility, and he comes back as Spider-Man. And that's that mentality again. If you can help someone, you have the ability to help someone, well, just help others in general, you should. And that's the entire core mentality that kind of pushes Spider-Man onwards. That is his entire motivation for doing what he does. This is where the Kingpin is introduced. Kingpin obviously has gone on to really be more synonymous with being a Daredevil villain, I think, but he started out as a Spider-Man villain. This is where he first appeared. And really with these reviews, with these videos, just as much as you get me talking about them, giving my thoughts, I like to make sure that I'm giving a good look through the book for anybody who's interested in it, really, to whether or not you want to go out and get it for yourself and read it for yourself. We just had confirmation from Name and Condition yesterday, as of the time of making this, that this book will be getting another printing. So I said this was the second printing. There was another printing that came out, I think, at the start of this year, and that's already out of print now, from what I understand, but it will be getting another printing again towards the end of this year. So it's another chance for anybody who's missed out on the book so far to get a hold of it. It's highly recommended by me. If you're interested in Spider-Man at all, I definitely recommend reading the Silver Age stuff. If you can get your hands on the first volume, and then volumes 2, 3 and 4, and even volume 5 is coming out this year. Very excited about that myself. Doc Ock coming back here. I find Doc Ock's a great villain, but he's the villain that I think annoys me the most. And he's supposed to be annoying. Obviously he's a villain, he's written to be that way, so I think that would just suggest that the stories are effective. But I just find him so annoying. Every time Spidey's fighting Doc Ock, I just really want to see him just knock him out. Just land a punch in his face and take the guy out, because he's so annoying. He's just always the one. Like, his schemes are always the most frustrating to see, and he's the one that I always want to see Spidey just take out the most, more than any of the other villains. I don't know, I can tolerate the other villains more, but Doc Ock just frustrates me. I just want to see him lose. Possibly because he shows up a little bit more often, I think. He's kind of positioned as being the sort of arch enemy, really. I think you could argue Spider-Man's arch enemy is either Green Goblin or Doc Ock. But I find the Goblin more interesting. I don't know what it is about Doc Ock. He's just kind of, I don't know, he's just the sort of arrogant, evil scientist, isn't he? If he didn't have the metallic arms, he'd just be an idiot scientist, that would have nothing special about him, really, compared to other villains, What else do we get? Aunt May. Aunt May is still constantly on death's door throughout this era. Really like this issue. Actually, there's a fun bit of trivia here. Just quickly show off that for what it's worth, issue 59 was actually the first time Mary Jane appeared on a cover of Amazing Spider-Man. And I think it's a really cool cover, though. Really nice, with her just dancing on stage, oblivious to the fact that just behind the curtain you got Spider-Man taking out goons. Really nicely drawn, by Romita. Really like the way that he draws faces. Like I say, the kind of handsome faces of the guys, the beautiful faces of the girls. Gwen and Mary Jane in particular just look really well drawn. You can tell that Romita kind of honed his style drawing romance comics, because whenever he's drawing the personal scenes featuring Peter Parker and his friends and love interests, it's just clearly so much skill that he puts into it, like, almost effortlessly, really. Like, I've seen John Romita drawing, on videos and stuff, not in person, as fun as that would be. But yeah, he just kind of, it's amazing. He just kind of puts the lines down. He's drawn a face before I could even start thinking about how to draw a face. He's come out with something amazing. And that's just evident through this whole book, really. And yeah, for what it's worth, again, just to reiterate that I highly recommend picking this up. This is the Spectacular Spider-Man magazine. So this is all in black and white. This is kind of experimental to see if it would sell well. I think the idea was they were thinking of launching, you know, a kind of supporting title that would be in black and white. Not really sure what the objective was with it. But this is quite a long story. It's about 50 or 60 pages, I think. But for whatever reason, it clearly didn't work out properly, because they didn't do another one of these. Not like this. They did one more issue of the Spectacular, but that was all in colour and more just a normal story, really. Really nice image of the Vulture there. At this point, Mary Jane turns up with a new hairstyle, which I think is... that hasn't really aged well, has it? I don't think that's a style that didn't even work well at the time. I think she only had this hairstyle for about 2 or 3 issues, and then she comes back with her more familiar long-haired style. Classic issue here with Spidey having to try and stop a prison breakout. And then you finish things off towards the end of the book with a couple of Mysterio issues. Mysterio is always one of those villains. I think when he shows up in the story, it's probably great fun for the artist to draw, because given that his whole thing is illusions and trickery and deceit, you can pretty much get away with drawing whatever you want, because at the end of the issue it turns out that none of it was real, so you don't have to worry about explanation. You just go, oh, Mysterio is using this machine that made Spider-Man think he was in space. Something like that. Yeah, this is the second Spectacular Spider-Man issue, which is a fight between... It's one of the times that Norman Osborn remembers he's the Green Goblin. So it's basically a prolonged fight between Spidey and the Goblin. Spidey ends up winning it by throwing one of the Goblin's gas bombs back at him, which makes him hallucinate, triggers some kind of psychological trauma again that once more represses the fact that he is the Goblin, and he forgets about it again for the time being. And, you know, whether or not you think Ditko or Romita is the better Spider-Man artist, I think that's just been one of the longest standing debates in comics between fans. There's reasons, valid reasons you can argue for both, but during John Romita's run, Amazing Spider-Man did become Marvel's top-selling series, and it overtook Fantastic Four in the #1 spot, and pretty much ever since has always been just about their best-selling series, certainly featuring a solo character anyway, which I think says a lot about the more broad appeal, I would say, to John Romita's art style. I think Ditko's artwork is always got a bit more of a niche appeal. It's not... I don't think everybody looks at Ditko's artwork and can appreciate how great it is. We're in the extras now, usual sort of stuff. You get sketches, covers of various reprint collections, and bits of artwork, kind of recoloured, redrawn bits of modern artwork. And that was the standard edition cover of the book, by the way. So a modern homage to the classic John Romita issue 39 cover by Humberto Ramos. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like that. I just don't. So, yeah. definitely prefer the original bit of work. But there you go. So a good look through the book, hopefully. Something to give you a good idea of whether or not you're interested in it. Yeah, I would just say, even if you're not much of a Silver Age fan, well worth checking out these Spider-Man volumes, because I think that Amazing Spider-Man is the very best of the Silver Age. Even between Marvel and DC, I don't think there was a better series. Fantastic Four being a close second, but really, Amazing Spider-Man was the most amazing Silver Age title for me. And this stuff is just such good fun. Always great to have a reread through now and then. And hopefully I will get back to it soon and give it another go through, because I always enjoy it. But thanks for watching anyway. If you enjoyed the video, as always, the usual YouTube stuff. You can like, leave a comment, subscribe, etc. I appreciate any kind of support you can give me. But otherwise, just thanks again for watching, and be back soon, hopefully with another video.